Hello, I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about distance and proximity in John Steinbeck's novella of Mice and Men. But first, what do we mean by proximity? Well, we're concerned with nearness in time, space and relationship. So while it doesn't necessarily have to be a physical closeness, we will be looking for how Steinbeck uses space within the novella. Different locations are important, for instance. Crook's stable, the bunkhouse, the house where Curley's wife resides. And these often, though not always, act as markers. They tell us something about the relationships within the book. Now, these two antithetical principles, distance and proximity, are vitally important because they relate to other significant themes within the novella. For example, companionship and isolation, two opposites again, have everything to do with how far away or close a certain character is to another. And what about dissatisfaction and longing? Well, Steinbeck allows us to consider how close or far away a character is from his or her dreams. Take Wit and his magazine. He finds a connection there to Bill Tenner, a former co-worker of his. What about George and the extent to which he feels close to his and Lenny's dream ranch? He speaks of the old people that owns it, a flat bust, and the lady needs an operation. But in this video, we're going to focus specifically on 6 extracts from the novella, in which we can unpack a little bit around the sense of distance and proximity between people. This is by no means an exhaustive analysis on what is arguably one of the most important themes in the book. So do go away and have a think about some other examples of closeness and detachment, of proximity and distance within the story. In the video description, I've included a link to a document of the extracts. First then, move my face out of the way. Let's have a look at this extract from the beginning of the novella, in which George and Lenny are arriving at the clearing that is so important structurally to the story. We're going to consider 4 main questions as we go through each extract. You can see them in the top right corner. So what kind of distance or proximity is established? Well, we see here for the first time the central relationship in the book. It's an unusual friendship because it violates the social norms of their time. George and Lenny are migrant workers, nomadic workers, moving from place to place in search of work. The idea of picking up a dependent, someone who relies on you for their existence, was unheard of. These are men who ought to be looking out for number one, not creating unnecessary risk for themselves. And so here's the description of George and Lenny right at the beginning of the novella. George threw a scoop of water into his face and rubbed it about with his hand under his chin and around the back of his neck. Then he replaced his hand, pushed himself back from the river, drew up his knees and embraced them. Lenny, who had been watching, imitated George exactly. He pushed himself back, drew up his knees, embraced them, looked over to George to see whether he had it just right. He pulled his hat down a little more over his eyes, the way George's hat was. And Steinbeck does an excellent job here of setting up this dependency through a highly effective physical symbol. Lenny imitated George exactly. Notice how we basically get a list of George's actions. See the verbs pushed himself back, drew up his knees and embraced them, followed by an identical list of Lenny's actions. This is almost a childlike response, isn't it? We kind of want to go, "Aww," and it's a totally appropriate response because George is cast as a kind of paternal figure with an obedient and admiring son. Except crucially, they are adults. Lenny Small is not small, he's huge. So here Steinbeck immediately sets up a relationship, one of very close proximity, that violates everything society is about in the 1930s. You'll have noticed that without asking the questions in the top right, we've looked at where we get a clear sense of these ideas, as well as how Steinbeck uses language and structure to convey them. And also, we've tried to relate it to the context, to 1930s America, the southern states in which this text is set and in which it was created. You could colour code those questions as we go through, and then your notes as well, as you jot down any important ideas around the extract. In this next section, George has been bemoaning the burden Lenny has on his life. But it becomes abundantly clear in this extract that George values the friendship Lenny offers. He likes the emotional intimacy, that sense of dependency. We see this best in the way that Lenny exploits George from a position of safety. Look at how Lenny sensed his advantage and the repetition of his threat to go off in the hills. It's almost absurd. The cave and the idea of him living by himself, they all create the picture of Lenny wanting affirmation and confirmation of George's love for him. Let's read it. If you don't want me, I can go off in the hills and find a cave. I can go away in time. No, look, I was just falling, Lenny, 'cause I want you to stay with me. Trouble with mice is you always kill 'em. He paused. Tell you what I'll do, Lenny. First chance I get, I'll give you a pup. Maybe you wouldn't kill it. That'd be better than mice. You could pet it harder. Lenny avoided the bait. He had sensed his advantage. If you don't want me, you only just gotta say so, and I'll go off in those hills right there. Ride up in those hills and live by myself. I won't get no mice stole from me. George said, I want you to stay with me, Lenny. Jesus Christ, somebody'd shoot you for a coyote if you was by yourself. No, you stay with me. Your Aunt Clara wouldn't like you running off by yourself, even if she is dead. It's almost like when somebody posts a new profile picture and the comments pour in. You're so beautiful, gorgeous, or just like hearts and emojis. And what is the original poster's response? It's, no, you are, or nah, I'm ugly. But they're fishing for compliments, aren't they? They want affirmation, a sense of security from their peers. And Lenny creates this pretense of distance, a threat that would never materialise, going off into the caves, going up into the hills, because he's seeking proximity from his peer, from George. In a turbulent world, one that has been ravaged by war and depression and natural disaster, the relationship that George and Lenny have is a sacred one that needs to be preserved. So for all George's talk of having such an easy life and going off to cat houses if he wasn't looking after Lenny, Steinbeck wants us to see that they possess a kind of unconditional closeness that will not be easily corrupted. Of course, it's worth pointing to the end of the novella here and saying that it does get ruined. Society does do its worst and the friendship is destroyed. But here we see George and Lenny both need the closeness that the other provides. Just a quick addendum. George tries to mask this, doesn't he, through acting like he only stays with Lenny through a sense of responsibility to Aunt Clara. Do we believe it? And it's worth considering whether or not we think that George is just looking after Lenny from a sense of obligation and responsibility because of a promise that he's made to his Aunt Clara. Or is there something deeper there? Is George valuing the friendship for his own ends because he knows the benefits and the advantages that it gives him? In this third extract, Candy is being challenged by Carson to get rid of his dog. Let's read it. Candy rolled to the edge of his bunk. He reached over and patted the ancient dog and he apologised. I've been around him so much, I never noticed how he stinks. Well, I can't stand him in here, said Carson. That stink hangs around even after he's gone. He walked over with his heavy-legged stride and looked down at the dog. Got no teeth, he said. He's all stiff with rheumatism and he ain't no good to you, Candy. He ain't no good to himself. Why don't you shoot him, Candy? The old man squirmed uncomfortably. Well, hell, I had him so long, I had since he was a pup. I herded sheep with him, he said proudly. You wouldn't think to look at him now, but he was the best damn sheepdog I ever seen. It's interesting that Candy cannot smell the dog because he's been around him so much. It's true, isn't it? You spend enough time somewhere or with someone and eventually that place feels like home. You don't notice the flaws because you value what the person or the place gives you. It's interesting too how Carson is a product of a brutal capitalist society. The state had a laissez-faire attitude, a do-it-yourself policy. There was effectively no welfare state, so it was every man for himself. In a world that's so orientated around the economy, on making money, on surviving, people begin to treat other people as commodities and not as human beings. And this is exactly what Carson cannot understand. He's ignorant to the relationship between Candy and his dog. He cannot fathom the dog's productivity. So the dog must be useless. It's worth considering here how clearly this links to the end of the novella, a section we'll explore in a little bit. This is totally deliberate on Steinbeck's part. The parallels between Candy's relationship with his dog and George's relationship with Lenny are vitally important to grasp. Carson's response is one of bemusement. He has been conditioned to put up a barrier where intimacy, closeness and friendship are involved. He seeks only to distance himself from relationships that will inevitably end in separation. And it's a coping mechanism, as he seeks to protect himself from the isolation that comes from an ephemeral and constantly changing workforce. This leads quite nicely onto the next section in which Lenny enters Crooks's barn. Why do I say it links? Well, Crooks is another character that uses his isolation as a sort of coping mechanism. Look at how he's described as a proud, aloof man. It even says he kept his distance. This is enforced segregation. So why does Steinbeck describe Crooks as somebody who enforces it himself? He goes on to tell Lenny, "You go on, get out of my room." The syntactic parallelism, that's where the word order and the word classes that are used are the same and follow the same pattern across two phrases or two words. This illustrates it well. This is a separation that goes both ways. I ain't wanted in the bunkhouse and you ain't wanted in my room. Why? I think it's because Crooks sees this as the only way of wresting back some kind of autonomy, some kind of freedom. He wants to preserve the sanctity of his space. He even reverses the insult that is levelled at him and says that the white people on the ranch stink to me. Now, Lenny seeks Crooks out. He wants to be close to another person because the others went into town. It's interesting, isn't it, how even when Lenny is temporarily left alone, he's desperate for companionship. And Crooks is too. If we read on, we would see how Crooks describes himself as sick. Without interaction with other people, people become mentally delirious. If we had time now, we could look too at the symbolism of light. Well, what do you want? Nothing. I seen your light. I thought I could just come in and sit. That's Lenny's response to Crooks. But what does it represent? How does Steinbeck use light to point us towards bigger ideas? And it's worth tracking that through the novella and looking at where he's used light and to what end. In this penultimate extract that we'll look at, Curley's wife enters Crooks's space. Lenny, of course, is already there, and now Candy is too. We've seen again and again the idea of proximity is often viewed as a threat. Other people are risks to safety and survival. This is layered with ideas about gender when Curley's wife is involved. She represents a unique kind of threat, and she recognises this when she says, "If I catch one man and he's alone, I get along fine with him." This raises the question, is Curley's wife perhaps the loneliest of all the characters in the book? Let's read it. She regarded them amusedly. "Funny thing," she said, "if I catch any one man and he's alone, I get along fine with him. But just let two of you guys get together and you won't talk. Just nothing but mad." She dropped her fingers and put her hands on her hips. "You're all scared of each other, that's what. Every one of you's scared the rest is going to get something on you." After a pause, Crooks said, "Maybe you'd better go along to your own house now. We don't want no trouble." "Well, I ain't giving you no trouble. Think I don't want to talk to somebody every once in a while? Think I like to stick in that house all the time?" And she's constantly seeking connection, isn't she? And she doesn't find it, at least not successfully. She ends up dead, after all. Steinbeck uses this coming together of an unlikely bunch to show how they are all, in their own ways, isolated and distant from each other. She says, "Think I like to stick in that house all the time?" And here is another kind of segregation. We've already seen it with Crooks. We've seen it with Candy's dog and Carson literally removing him and shooting him. And this is a segregation in which Curley's wife is kept and repressed by her husband. She's the only woman, and she is known only by her association with her husband, her name, Curley's wife, and she's refused the connection that she longs for. He's constantly running after her and checking where she is, isn't he? Steinbeck deliberately uses her as a way to highlight yet another type of person who exists in an America severely lacking in proximity, in closeness. This is an America torn apart by everything that's happened over the last 30 years, from 1900 to the 1930s. And Steinbeck paints a picture of a society that's insular and self-focused. Go along to your own house now, Crook says, and this is where his barrier lifts again. Steinbeck shows us how quickly the defence mechanisms can be reactivated, how quickly the promise and hope of connection, of proximity, can be dashed by a society that simply will not allow these relationships to flourish and thrive. And what's the best example of this in the novella? Well, it's George and Lenny's friendship, isn't it? This is one typified by closeness, one that violates the social norms of their time. It bemuses pretty much everybody, doesn't it? The boss thinks George is using Lenny. Slim questions George about why they go around all the time. Curley doesn't like what he sees, and so this cannot be allowed to continue. In a society that creates distance between people, that separates them depending on their value to the production system, based on their race or their gender or their age, this friendship won't last. It's temporary. Think of the title from the poem by Robert Burns, To a Mouse. The best laid plans of mice and men often go astray. But does Steinbeck leave us with some hope? The novel is circular. 2 men walk down the trail and 2 men leave. Do Slim and George embark on a new friendship with one another? At the end of the book, Steinbeck sets up a kind of distance between Carson and Curley, the generation of men without the emotional intimacy that every human needs to survive, and perhaps, a new generation that recognises the importance of connection, proximity. So have a think about those 2 themes together. They're a bit like power and weakness, companionship and isolation, distance and proximity. Who is separated from whom? Who is close to who? And have a think about those ideas, annotate these extracts, and then you'll have some really good ideas to write about in an essay on something to do with these themes.